Let me start with my journey from Shillong. From Shillong, I went to Pune because that's the first milestone, right, before I entered the corporate world. I did my MBA, and that's when I lost my first job before even getting one. So that was the first time I experienced what uncertainty really is. You're out in this large corporate world where you're nobody, right? You're one of a small fish in a large pond. And making yourself, therefore, visible, through your work. Honestly, for me, hard work, I would give more weightage, 80%, right? But there's this 20% that I would say is luck. All you need to do is listen, not just hear, listen. Most of the organizations are not spending time listening to what people are saying. Listening, acknowledging, then coming and putting together a set of actions that you're really walking the talk. And, simplifying the entire thing. You can't talk, culture in jargons, right? You have to really simplify it so that last person in that order really understands and gets it. Many a times you have to lead transformation with courage because you have to be the change catalyst while people around you may be hesitant. So it is with a lot of resilience, with emotional intelligence, yes, but equally emotional detachment. Be confident, know your staff, know the business context, right? That will earn you credibility. The second is have the courage. I've always felt that confidence is not a lack of, self-doubt. In fact, it's about moving forward despite having it, right? And every time you face self-doubt, take a step back, judge the circumstances, right? And the context, right? And start playing with your strength. It is your story. It is your achievement, right? Don't just talk about degrees, talk about what have you done, right? What is going to differentiate you versus somebody else?
Today's guest is someone who's blended grace with grit, strength with heart. Pavitra Singh, CHRO, PepsiCo India and South Asia.
She's someone who's not only worked in HR, but actually shaped it. From being an HR BP to leading cultural transformations, she's won accolades internally as well as externally. Pavitra represents the kind of leadership which walks the talk.
It's not a usual conversation for HR professionals. It's a conversation for everyone who's building their career with a lot of purpose, patience, and courage to stay true to themselves in the process. Welcome, Pavitra, on Office Tales and People podcast.
Thank you, Shikha. Thank you, Priyanka.
I'm so excited to have you here today, Pavitra. Are you ready to roll?
Absolutely ready. Let's bring it on.
Okay, so here's the first one. So, Pavitra, I know you're from Shillong. It's such a nice, pristine place, very quiet. And when you entered into the corporate world, what was the difference or what was so different that you saw when you came into this world?
Great. So, yeah, let me start with my journey from Shillong, right? Like you said, Shillong, a very small, quiet place. Everybody knew each other, right? From Shillong, I went to Pune because that's the first milestone, right, before I entered the corporate world. And I think Pune was a bigger canvas, right, a melting pot. And that's when I first learned, what it really means to interact with different cultures. I did my MBA, and that's when I lost my first job before even getting one, right? And that, I must say, was a harsh, big bolt. But it was my first welcome to the corporate world because that's what we live in today, right? We live with so much of uncertainty. So that was the first time I experienced what uncertainty really is. Moving into a corporate world, different ball game, similar in many ways, right? But different in many, many ways, because suddenly, from the comfort of a small city, where you are protected in many ways, you're out in this large corporate world where you're nobody, right? You're one of a small fish in a large pond, right? And making yourself, therefore, visible, through your work, right? Because here in a corporate environment, you are judged based on, how you perform, the impact that you make, right? So it's a different ball game. You have to, start looking at networks very differently. You need to start, making sure that your work is speaking for itself. And I think what really worked for me when I was doing this transition is, be yourself, bring your authentic self but equally focus on your work, right? Don't focus on what others are doing, and how others are doing, right? Focus on your work and let your work speak. And I think that transition in my head has made a lot of difference and has impacted me along my journey. So yeah, but it's interesting. It may be scary for many, but I think just live that moment, focus on what you need to do, and yeah, things will turn out fine.
Lovely, fantastic.
So, Pavitra, you've gone up the ladder with a lot of hard work, a lot of patience. What were the key moments in your life, in your professional journey, that shaped your career?
Where do I begin? There are so many personal moments and milestones, right? Now, let me begin right from the beginning. I mentioned my first job, which I lost, right? This was during the dot-com bubble bust. So while all my friends had, new jobs, I was left with no job, knocking on doors, looking for something. But I think that was a critical pivot or a learning moment for me because, I decided to join and take a very different path. Okay, joined a design training institute, and I was tasked with turning that around, right? And it was working with folks who were far more seasoned. It was a design center. I had no idea. I had no idea of P&L responsibility. But I think that moment really turned things because, I learned lessons that have stayed with me about how do you work with people, how do you kind of roll your sleeves, and work towards a vision that you collectively build, right, and collaborate with the teams and make that common vision a rallying cry for everybody, right? So a very humbling moment, but I think that stayed on with me till today. The second milestone really was my first promotion. It was very early on, and it was a great validation of your hard work, right? Coming from a non-premier institute, right? I think that's something that in the beginning I've always felt, and but just the sheer fact that yes, you get promoted because of the hard work is a great validation. So I think it was a thrilling moment when I got my first promotion. The next is when you get people management responsibility, right? Because before that you're just thinking about yourself, how you're progressing, how you're doing. But when you start having people in your team, it's about then thinking of your team. How can you help them grow and develop? So I think that's another moment when you then grow up very differently as a person, as a leader. Then a new milestone when I got into senior leadership, right? Because suddenly you are in a larger stage. The radar is on you, everybody's looking at you, and there is an opportunity for you to create a very different impact. And then you start aspiring for bigger stages, right? Because you get that confidence. Personally, milestones, my daughter, when she was born, I think that teaches you, motherhood teaches you very different things, right? And it kind of you discover things about you which you probably didn't know existed, right? So the dormant sides of you come out. So I think that for me, again, a very big milestone. Another milestone related to her was when I took a sabbatical, and it was again very pivotal because it was at the peak of one of my career stints. I decided to take a step back, and what I thought was a step back for her was actually a step forward in many ways for myself, right? Because that pause, reflect moment that came with that sabbatical helped me to again repivot my leadership style, right? It gave me a moment to really think through and say, what do I want to do? How do I want to pivot my style? What is the legacy that I want to, leave behind? And I think that sabbatical for many seemed like a break, but for me, it became a multiplier, right? And of course, having mentors, having great mentors along the way. I think I consider them as great milestones in my life. And a big slice of luck really is about being at the right places at the right time, right assignments coming at the right time, and you being able to take those opportunities. So yeah, in a nutshell, many, many moments that I cherish, and I'm very thankful that I had those moments.
So, you talked about luck, and I really, really want to ask you this question. How much percentage would you give hard work versus luck out of 100%? How much one should put in hard work and leave the rest on luck?
Well, okay. Honestly, for me, hard work, I would give more weightage, 80%, right? But there's this 20% that I would say is luck, being at the right time, right place, right moment.
Yes, absolutely. So the next one, Pavitra, what I want to know from you is, all organizations, most leaders, they talk about people are important, culture is important, but not everybody is able to walk the talk. And I've heard you've done a lot of good work on culture transformations, and which have also been recognized and, got a lot of accolades. I just want to learn from you, what is it that you did, and what are your learnings from there, and what should other organizations learn from it?
So I think let me begin with, addressing what is culture, right? And, I'm sure you've been to a coffee shop, or, where you've got this amazing aroma of coffee, and that differentiates from a good coffee shop to another, right? Because you can make out, you can feel it, and you want to drink that cup of coffee, right? Culture is exactly that, right? It is the smell of the place, and you don't need to ask anybody about culture of an organization. You can feel it the moment you walk inside the organization. The doors of the reception open and you enter and you see how you're greeted. The feel of the place, the warmth, how people are treating you. Are you being made to wait? For hours before that meeting, or people are respecting your time. And I genuinely believe a meeting is a great litmus test of culture. Just go into a meeting and observe, right? And you will know exactly what the culture is. What is the mood of the meeting? Are people tensed, scared? Or is there fun and banter, and the environment is light? Are people asking questions without fear? Especially when you have the CEO in the meeting and you have senior leadership in the meeting, right? So how are people behaving? Do they challenge each other? Do they talk? There can be disagreements, but how do they come to a consensus? And what's more important is what happens after the meeting. What are people saying? Are people saying that, okay, what happened inside is, okay, we don't agree with it, right? And that narrative goes down. Or are people walking out, knowingly that I don't agree with it, but we've agreed together as a team,
Yes,
right?
and so let's go do it.
Let's go ahead and do it, right? So I think there's a lot that you can. So you don't really need a survey to get that pulse, right? All you need to do is listen, not just hear, listen, right? And I think a lot of organizations get this wrong, because most of the organizations are not spending time listening to what people are saying, right? And listening is not just about listening to just a set of people sitting in the headquarters. You will never get the pulse, right? It is about going to the last mile, talking to your front line, talking to different cohorts and understanding what they're saying, right? And it begins from the top. And that's been my personal learning, right? That culture change has to begin from the top, right? The leaders have to set the tone. And again, it begins from, our leaders open enough to really listen first, because the organization's telling you something. People are telling you something, right? So are you listening? Are you acknowledging? Because, you can have all the elephants on the table, but if you're not going to acknowledge, what's coming up, then there's just no point, right? So listening, acknowledging, then coming and putting together a set of actions that you're really walking the talk. So you can't have a say-do gap, right? I'm saying something, but I'm not doing it. And therefore that just leads to loss of credibility, because nobody's being consistent and nobody's walking the talk, right? So I think some of these things, when we started the culture journey, I think these were important, building blocks, right? And then it's about just not the top leadership, but what is the next N-1 thinking, right? How do you bring them on the same page? Because they are your generals, they are leading large teams. So if they're not on the same page in terms of what we are articulating as a culture shift, or the new values or the new behaviors, right? You can't orchestrate this across the organization, Then the other things, of course, makes a lot of difference. Are your process aligned to, the new norms or the new behaviors that you're trying to drive? Your reward and recognition framework, is that talking to that, right? Are you making sure that you're also sharing the stories of how people are shifting that, across, and, simplifying the entire thing? You can't talk, culture in jargons, right? You have to really simplify it so that the last person or the last person in that order really understands and gets it. That, hey, this is what it really means, and this is how I can contribute. So I think it's not one silver bullet, but it starts from the top, and then it's about really simplifying things, rallying the organization, and most importantly, walking the talk and being consistent.
So, Pavitra, I want to ask you on the question you just said that, say-do gap.
Yeah.
There's a lot of digital hiring, and people hire digitally and they are hired to work digitally. In that process, do you think culture can still be made felt for the people who are coming on board? And if so, what are some key hygiene steps for organizations that they must keep in mind?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think we realized that, especially during COVID, right, when everything was remote and we were getting people, joining us remotely. So, how do you assimilate people and get them to really understand this new culture, this ways of working? I think a lot has to do with leaders taking that ownership as well. Like simple things. How are you conducting the meetings? Are you involving and including everybody, right? At least the way we did it was, first we kind of sensitized all the newcomers in terms of what is our new way of working, what is our culture, right? I think very important to first create that awareness, but demonstrating that in virtual platforms, okay? And that was a training that we did, and I think we follow that. We have the tendency of going back, and there is always a tendency of going back to what was the old ways of working, but making sure that you are involving and asking simple questions. Hey, let's go round robin, for example, right? Do you have a point of view? Do you want to contribute? Because you have to understand, for a newcomer, it becomes very difficult, and a remote setup can become very threatening.
They don't know whether they can speak up, whether they can ask a question, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a leader, you have a role, in making sure that the newcomer feels, accepted and feels comfortable and not threatened, right? So simple tips and cues, of making sure that you're involving everybody and making them participate. I think those are things that you need to do. I do believe, while it might be a remote setup, getting everybody together, whether it's once a quarter, one can decide what the frequency is, to just bond, because it is, at the end of the day, culture is the smell and the feel of the place. How do you make sure that you also incorporate some of those, intentional meetings where people come together, they feel it, right? Because once you've broken the ice and you create that bond, you can go back, and you can still work because the ice is got broken. So I think some of those things you have to be very intentional about it, and just navigate. We're all learning through this, I would say. So there's no perfect answer, but we just learn through some of these experiences.
So Pavitra, from HRBP to CHRO is not an easy journey. I'm sure you had to do a lot of mind shift and a lot of attitude change to be in this role and to also succeed in this role. What are those key things that you have done in the journey that made you the leader that you are?
The role of an HRBP is like, flying a single jet, a single, aircraft, right? You are wired into the business. You understand what's happening. You are, on ground, executing, solving, challenges and conflicts that are coming day to day, right? And partnering with the business. But a CHRO role is like, you're navigating, you're the air traffic controller of a large airport, right? Where there's so much of complexity. Okay. There are different aircrafts moving around, and you're not just responsible for one, but many moving in different directions, yet they need to operate in harmony, right? So it's a big shift, while yes, HRBP is a fantastic grounding path to get into a CHRO role, but yet you still have, you have a myopic lens to it, right? Because you're busy with the humdrum. But the biggest shift in a CHR role is that you have to start having a panoramic view, right? And you have to learn how to zoom out and not get into the weeds, into the day-to-day firefighting, right? And you need to start looking at it more strategically, more systematically, and more future focused, right? And the questions that you would, really start asking or shaping as a CHRO, would be things like, okay, how do I see the organization in the next 5 years, right? So it's a longer term, viewpoint that, what is the capabilities? What are the skills that I need, which I need to possibly build, buy, borrow, right? What are the kind of values, behaviors, that I need to, a mindset that you mentioned that I need for the organization to change or navigate to what we want to aspire for? And lastly, how do you want to shape the culture while meeting the business outcomes, right? So I think the biggest shift in mindset is from a business partnering to a business challenger role, right? Because as a CHRO, you need to start challenging, because you are now looking at the business holistically, right? It's not one lens, but multiple lens, right? So are you playing the challenger role, of challenging the org structure, challenging the cost structure, challenging, okay, what kind of talent capability do we need? Where do we want to invest in people, right? So challenging status quo in different ways, right? And many a times you have to lead transformation with courage, because, you have to be the change catalyst. while people around you may be hesitant. So it is with a lot of resilience, with emotional intelligence, yes, but a lot of resilience and sometimes emotional intelligence, yes, but equally emotional detachment, right? Because you have to, take tough calls, make tough choices, and sometimes lead tough transformation, and be the change catalyst when others are not willing to do that, right? So it's a big shift in terms of, how you start looking at it, but it is a fantastic, an HRBP role is a fantastic grooming ground, right? Yeah, and foundation, to that larger role.
So, Pavitra, I'm very, very curious because you use the term detachment and you are a woman. As per data, women have been traditionally more emotional when it comes to their decision making. Were you emotional when you were younger? And have you dealt with your emotions more maturely and have started learning or have started performing in a more emotionally matured manner? And how could you do that? A lot of women struggle with that because I have been running a women's group. So this is a constant question that comes from them, that how should I detach? This is a very constant question in the women's group. What would you like to share on this particular aspect?
No, I think, first of all, there's nothing wrong in showing emotions, right? And it's not just a women's thing, right? Everybody has emotions and they show it very differently, right? And I always believe as a leader, it's important to be vulnerable and it's okay to show that vulnerability because you're a human being. So I don't operate from a space where, okay, no emotions, right? You need to be very hard faced and hardwired. No, right? I think there's a thin line between the detachment to showing those emotions, right? I think as a leader, you need to be vulnerable. You need to be, it's okay, right? And it's okay to say, I don't know it. I need help. It's absolutely okay, right? But when it comes to tough the decisions, I think it's important because the lens or the radar for me has always been, or the compass for me has always been that is this the right thing to do for the organization? Right, because you will always be faced with dilemmas, but the moment you have your principles laid out very clearly, that am I doing the right thing, am I keeping organization first, then team, and then individual, right? The moment you have those principles in mind, you know what you're doing is right, right? And the moment you have this practical aspect of it, you're able to kind of, move those emotions. You might be feeling a lot inside, but you are able to move that because, you've got those principles or the compass very clearly laid out, right? And that's something I've practiced because you know what you're doing is right.
So, just I wanted to also pick up another question. So, you talked about the HRBP becoming the doers, from the doers to the challengers. And we all know that it's easier said than done. So, if there are two tips that you could give for HRBPs to, what should they do to become those challengers as actionable,
Yeah.
or, tips that you can
Yeah,
give?
sure. So I think first of all, know your content, know your stuff, right? Because before you challenge, right, you need to know your work or what are you challenging, right? I often find people just challenging for the sake of challenging without even knowing their facts and figures, right? So be confident, know your stuff, know the business context, right? That will earn you credibility, right? And that will make that pushback far more easier because you know your stuff, right? The second is have the courage. Again, I see a lot of HRBPs, they know the stuff, but they don't have the courage to just, call a spade or challenge, right? What's the worst that can happen, right? I always believe if you tell the truth, you actually command and you earn that respect. Don't let that go. So two things, just know your stuff, know your content.
And have the
Yeah,
courage.
and have the courage.
Thank you so much for that. So, Pavitra, you've had such a long journey, a beautiful one, a lovely career. Obviously, you would have had mentors during your journey. So, any one mentor who made a big difference, and how did that change your career?
I've had many mentors, so very tough to kind of give you one. But I think the trick with the mentors is, I do believe that you can't choose a mentor. The mentor has to choose you, right? And the mentor has to see the value, the potential, the growth mindset that you bring out, right? And it needs to align with what the mentor thinks. right? So I often, people ask me, how can I get mentors? And that's my honest truth, right? That, the mentors have to select you, right? And as I said, I've been very fortunate to have many mentors, and I've picked up many different things, right? There's some mentors who've been my sounding boards. Every time I have a dilemma, I go to them, and they are true sounding boards. There are other mentors who are like role models, they display or demonstrate behaviors that you want to be like them, right? And you want to pick up those behaviors. There are also anti mentors, right? People who what they bring and what you don't want to pick from them. That's also important because it gives you clarity that what is it that you don't want to become. And then it's a funny twist of tail because, today I have a digital mentor in my daughter, right? Because reverse mentoring, she teaches me, right? All the social, tools, buzzwords, right? So I learn a lot from her. And I truly believe, right, that, reverse mentoring is a very important aspect. And it just also helps you it's a reminder that mentoring is not about age or experience, right? It's about the value that the person brings and it's mutual respect.
So, Pavitra, leadership can bring a lot of self doubt amongst everyone, but especially women. What are some key, maybe tips or something that you did to deal with your self doubts that you were experiencing in your journey?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, it's absolutely normal to have self doubts, right? Experiencing, and everybody experiences some bits of self doubt, right? Because the moment you have self doubt, it really means that, you are being curious and you're open to growth, right? So having a bit of it is great. It's healthy, right? In fact, the absence of self doubt actually leads to arrogance. Okay. So, yes, important. And, I've had my moments of self doubt, right? When I moved into a CHRO role, it was a large role. And yes, I doubted, can I do this? When COVID happened, right, was navigating a very different order of ambiguity. You have self-doubt. Can you do it, right? In fact, very recently, I was invited to a board meeting. And my first board meeting, and the first one, I didn't speak, right? I was observing through the sidelines, not sure when I was questioning that, why am I here, right? Am I the right pick? Okay. And I wasn't sure. But by the second board meeting, right, I found my voice, right? Not and that voice was not because I was trying to or pretending, to make stuff, but operating from what I knew, my strength, right? And contributing through the strengths that I brought to the table. And I think that's a very important piece, Women naturally, or because of the way they're groomed, they're always taught to be perfect before they can speak up or step up, right? And I've always felt that confidence is not a lack of, self-doubt. In fact, it's about moving forward despite having it, right? And every time you face self-doubt, take a step back, judge the circumstances, right? And the context, right? And start playing with your strength, because that strength leads to a cycle of strength, So when you're able to speak once, second time, and coming from a space of what you know and your strength, automatically you will start, garnering. And, in fact, when I think of self-doubt, it's like, the beginning of, and not the new automatic cars, but the old time cars, right? When you're kind of having trouble, switching on the ignition, right? And that hesitation before the ignition, okay, that's self-doubt. But the moment it's on and you're in motion, you've kind of, crossed that hurdle, or when you're going up a stage, you have butterflies, and then those butterflies are great, right? But once you've moved away from that hurdle, that first few seconds after that, you're on a roll.
In the flow.
Right?
Yeah.
So self-doubt is great. I think own it, okay, with pride, but don't get bogged down by it, right? Just play from your space of strength and move on.
In organizations, we have people in our teams in HR who are not HRBPs. Some are in total rewards, some are in L&D, and they might be aspiring to become CHROs. What are the 2 or 3 things you would give them as advice on what should they do now to become or take those steps towards becoming a CHRO?
Yeah, Very good question, because I have a lot of people who come to me saying that, okay, I've just done COE roles, right? How do I now start? And I don't have an HRBP experience, but how do I get to that, right? I think, one will have to start looking at what that CHR role really entails, right? And start building some of those muscles, and I'll talk about three things, the three C's, I call it, right? The first is having the right context. When I say context, it really means, do you have the right business context? Okay, so you could be in total rewards, you could be in talent acquisition, you could be crafting different programs, right? Are you already starting to look at it, from a business context, right? And asking questions, saying that, okay, how is this particular initiative tying with what my organization vision is, right? What is the ROI? Is it impacting the growth, profitability, or reducing attrition, right? So start thinking of some of those linkages, because what you're doing right now is from just one lens, which is the CE role, but how do you kind of magnify that, expand that to start looking at enterprise impact? Because that's what the CHRO does, right? Because you have a holistic picture. The second is, really looking at cross-functional credibility. So that's my second C, right? Start looking at projects, or start when you're doing a particular initiative or program that you're crafting, reach out to people from different functions, right? Because a CHRO can't lead a people agenda by just looking at their own function. You have to collaborate with people from finance, from legal, sales, commercial, right? So start wiring with people across the functions, okay? And start talking to them. And it also helps you as you're baking your program or your intervention, because you start understanding what are the needs, what are people asking, right? And again, bringing in linkages, to what and how it can impact the broader organization. And the third C is really about, seeking challenges and complexity, right? Raise your hand for projects which are different from what you are doing. Move out of your comfort zone, okay? And it could be simple things, maybe the organization is going through an M&A. Raise your hand saying, hey, I want to be a part of it, or I want to lead the change, right? Or maybe a particular unit is facing a lot of attrition. You can raise your hand and say, hey, I want to be a part of the task force and do a dipstick in terms of understanding why attrition is happening, okay? Or being a part of a transformation project. So there are multiple initiatives, enterprise-wide, or maybe specific to a particular business unit that are there. All you need to do is move out of your comfort zone, raise your hand and say, hey, I want to be a part of that project, right? So you start understanding and start getting embedded.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I think the three C's, and if you're able to kind of do that, people will start noticing, right? People will start saying that, hey, here's this person who's kind of moving out of the comfort zone, wanting to learn, should I punt on that person? Maybe a HRBP is the next step before you move on.
So, Pavitra, you have seen so many job seekers evolve, through this entire journey of yours. Have you seen any change in job seekers from the times, let's say 2010, 15 to now? And if so, what have you noticed? And is there an advice for them?
So I think the biggest shift has been around employability and how we look at employability versus, degrees, titles, or about the relevance through skill sets that you bring to the table, adaptability, your mindset, right? That's a big shift, because in the past, everybody valued, degrees, right? And you would be employable based on that. Today, with the kind of evolving, pace, the way the organizations or the external environment is moving around you, the pace has really changed. What existed today no longer exists tomorrow, right? And that's the new norm. And you have to be ready with that, right? And I think a couple of things I would say if you have to make yourself ready for this, shift, right? The first thing I would say is that write your own CV. It is your story. It is your achievement, right? Don't just talk about degrees, talk about what have you done, right? What is going to differentiate you versus somebody else? Okay, I think that's very important. It should be your narrative and not a chat GPT. Okay. The second, I would say don't lose onto credibility, right? In a world where there's so much of noise and clutter, right? I think trustworthiness and the credibility that you've built, will make you stand out. Okay. It takes years to build a reputation. It takes minutes to lose it. Right. So I think it's very important to focus on that. I think the third is really double down on soft skills, right? So while you have machines or AI that will help you crunch that data, you do need humans to build relationship, to build trust, right? And some of these softer skill sets in terms of being able to lead with empathy, lead with influence, lead with a resolution mindset, right, are very important in the new age, right? So double down on that. And lastly, I would say that, your career, is like you have to start looking at it as a portfolio, because your career is going to be, across multiple companies, multiple industries, right? And therefore, are you really starting to look at building lifelong skills, which are fungible, right? Which will stay with you wherever you go and doesn't really matter what kind of disruption. So, for example, digital savviness, right? I spoke of softer skills, collaboration, right? So, I think start looking at some of those that are lifelong skills, and that will take you from irrespective of industry or irrespective of, roles or stints or companies that you are in. So the game has definitely changed. The rules of the game has changed, right? But I think it's important not to look at it as a threat. Look at it as an opportunity, because remember, the career is always, in your hands. So you decide how you want to shape it and how successful you want it, while leading with purpose. So yeah, shape your career.
So, on the next one, Pavitra, I want to know one advice you would give to your younger self. Say it's 2015 now, which is maybe 10 years back. What would that one advice be?
I think look forward. What's happened is done and dusted. So no point delving in the past. Look forward, because that's where the future is.
Thank you so much, Pavitra, for being with us on OTP. It was an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you today.
Likewise, thank you.
So, this episode with Pavitra Singh was much more than office tales and people. It was about purpose, it was about patience and perseverance. We hope that you had a great time watching Office Tales and People podcast. Until next time, when Priyanka and I will bring you another interesting guest on Office Tales and People podcast, I want you to share this episode with all your friends and colleagues. Bye for now.